Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. I am Amanda.
I'm Laura.
And I'm Kendra.
And today we are honored to have a special guest, an emergency medicine physician, Dr. Marc-David Munk. He has a book, Urgent Calls from Distant Places, an emergency doctor's notes about life and death on the frontiers of East Africa. It's an on-the-ground account of his time as a flight surgeon serving 11 East African countries, the unimaginable challenges he and his team faced in providing medical care to patients suffering from severe trauma and disease, and the immense gratification he found in healing under such challenging conditions. Mark's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in seemingly hopeless places, and the transformative power of healing. He has appeared on ABC News, PBS NewsHour, NPR, and CBS News. His work has been featured in Business Insider, USA Today, and Health Leaders magazine. What an honor. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Munk.
Hey, Amanda. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks, Kendra. Thanks, Laura.
Yeah, we're super excited. This is a different perspective that we don't always get to have. So thank you for your time, and we'll get going here. So in order for our audience to get to know you a little better, can you tell us about you, your medical training, the medical positions you've held, and how you started your adventures?
Sure. So I'm an emergency physician, maybe with a slightly unconventional track into emergency medicine. I started off really in the humanities in college and would have never under 1,000 years imagined that I would have ended up as a physician. I was studying philosophy and religion, not particularly, useful necessarily skills. But along the way, I ended up volunteering in the small town's local ambulance service where I was in college. And over time, I think many of us actually started in EMS and ended up in emergency medicine, a fairly common story, but it became a bit of a passion for me over the course of undergrad. And when I graduated college, I decided to become a physician, and I had to go back and do all my sciences, and finally ended up in medical school about 4 years later than most of my classmates, and did medical school in Philadelphia and then training in emergency medicine at the University of Pittsburgh. And got finally to the end of that program, became an attending, did a fellowship in international emergency medicine for a year where I got tropical medicine training, and then set off in what I thought was going to be a career in academic emergency medicine. And I'll say I pretty quickly hit a wall. As soon as I, dipped my toe into attending medicine, I realized that really it had to raise questions for me as to whether or not that was what I should be doing with my life and whether that was a path forward. And it was honestly a bit disenchanting because I had spent so many years cranking to get to that goal. And I woke up one morning, I wasn't sure whether it's what I wanted to do.
Yeah, that is not uncommon. You have just explained the path of many of us, unfortunately. Not that, we want to belabor that point, but just to share your story, Dr. Monk, and knowing that there's at least one of us, one ER doc out there that can relate. If not more, I will say more. And just being able to normalize this conversation is why we do this podcast. So perfect. I love it. Speaking of the burnout, how did it affect you? How did you notice it early on? And then what were next steps?
Yeah, it was profound. I really had approached, as I said, this concept of being an emergency physician as the end point for me. And it felt like all of the steps had been leading up to that point. And so I remember starting to dread going into shifts. And like I would lay in bed at night knowing I had a 7 a.m. shift and would sort of really worry about going in. And the funny thing about that was that my concerns really weren't about the acuity of the cases, and my concerns weren't necessarily about the types of patients we saw or the environment of the emergency department. I mean, all of that is challenging, but I knew it and was kind of looking forward to that work. The thing that sort of I was pushing back against was what I felt was the industrialization of medicine. And you guys know this very well, but this sort of sense that you could never really do a good enough job, that there was the patient in front of you and you felt like you were constantly having to rush through it because there were 10 more patients to be seen. And some of them were sicker and you didn't know who in the waiting room was sicker than the one you had in front of you. And it felt like ultimately all of the dysfunction in the healthcare space funneled into the emergency department because we were the only part of the hospital that didn't have any breaks. Like the door was always open in emergency medicine. And so the administrators in the hospital were happy to have patients come into the ER and sit around, but they weren't prepared to have them flow through the system, through the floor, and then outpatients, and all the places they're supposed to go if the system's functioning well. And it also struck me that nobody really cared about it, that there was this acceptance of this highly, highly dysfunctional and dangerous system, and I was expected to sit in the middle of it. And I just felt myself grinding down. I felt like I had been a little bit deceived, honestly, that the support that I thought would be there for the important work that I was doing just didn't materialize. And I say this with a little bit of an asterisk, which is that I, at this point, had only been in attending for maybe 2-3 years. And I know there are many of my colleagues who have been going at this for 20 and 30 years and have far better tolerance for the dysfunctional system than I did. And props to them, because thank goodness these people are going to work and keeping the lights on, because if they didn't, we'd be in a whole lot worse pain than we are now. But it was, for me, kind of the first time that I had a reckoning. I was feeling all of the classic signs of burnout, but this sort of lack of empathy for me was the most concerning aspect of it, that I just basically had stopped caring as much as I should. And I think what I found was that when you stop caring, all of the tensions inherent in that work feel much greater. Like if you don't feel like the work you're doing is necessarily purposeful, and you can't empathize with the people you're caring for, the grind seems to be much harder. And that for me was what was catching me out. And so I decided it was time to step away and to see if I could find a little bit of space to sit down and listen to my inner voices and to try to figure out what I was going to do, because I was quite frightened by that point. Like it felt like either you grind it out and it's nothing that I was looking forward to, or you start at the beginning, and I just wasn't sure what else I could do as an emergency doctor. I'd spent so many years training to become an attending doctor. I wasn't sure what else there was to do. So I needed space to step back and ask myself some hard questions. And that's where Africa came in.
I think that you have just so incredibly eloquently stated exactly the same sentiments that I had. It's like, this is so important and it feels like nobody cares. Why does nobody care? This is an obvious problem, and it just feels like you're banging your head against a wall. I just heard for the first time at a conference that we just attended the term from Christina Shenby, I think Dr. Christina Shenby had said it, institutional betrayal. And I was like, oh, that sounds like something accurate that I felt. But anyway,
it was
interesting that so many of us have that feeling.
I agree. And one of the other terms that's come up a lot is moral injury, which I really can identify with, which is the care that we were providing was in many ways a betrayal of what I thought was important in medicine. And I was forced to behave like that, because otherwise people really would die. But we didn't have enough resources to behave otherwise. And so it was this awful conundrum.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Dr. Munk. I think that moral injury, we have just revamped our Wellness 911 course. And one of the things that in our resilience module that I had mentioned was, some people get real cringy about that word burnout because they just feel like it's tired and overused. But really that's that personal battle, that personal struggle of the dissension between wanting to do what's right and what is important and everything. And then kind of like your hands are tied and not being able to, for whatever reason. Could be lack of resources, could be that you feel like your administration doesn't support you, could be because you feel like you're working less is more, do more with less, whatever it is. But that moral injury, really that definition puts the onus on the organization. It says, I have a dissension between what I know that I'm supposed to show up and do every day and what I feel is right for our patients. And the institution I work for is not providing that environment, those resources, whatever for me. And so it's that constant going to work every single day with that total disconnect, not being able to reconcile that, knowing what we should do, but then our organization. So it really puts the onus on them. And I think that better captivates the audience for sure, when you can feel like, oh yeah, we also need to hold our organizations accountable.
Yeah, we'll talk about this maybe in the later part of the interview. I mean, I subsequent to Africa made a real career pivot, and my pivot was to try to go back and work to fix the system a little bit outside of emergency medicine. I became an executive in value-based healthcare spaces, and I've only worked for value-based organizations since then, because I think really what drives a lot of the dysfunction is the fee-for-service model, where it's just incentivizing, cranking through patients and all the bad things inherent to fee-for-service. But it took a little time to get there. And I think one of the things I've learned, and we'll talk about Africa in a second, is that in Africa, of course, there's a lot of scarcity, but the scarcity is just because there aren't a lot of resources and people are poor, and it's just sort of an awful conundrum. The challenges in the United States are that there are plenty of resources, but we've just decided as a matter of policy not to fund certain things properly and to not fund emergency medicine well, and to stick them in the basement and to have them run on a shoestring. It's nothing inherent to that. It's not like there aren't enough resources to fund a really top-notch emergency care system where people have great access and serve. We've just made policy decisions that force that to have happened. And so I think one of the moral quandaries is we're sitting as physicians in the ER, and we know full well it's not that we're living in this sort of it's not that there's been a disaster or there's terrible scarcity or we're making do. We're making do just because somebody made the policy decisions to not resource us properly.
Absolutely.
And that's the hurtful part of it.
So let's get into this Africa journey. What is AMREF, and how did its Flying Doctors in East Africa program help you rediscover your passion for medicine?
Yeah, AMREF is a fascinating organization. It's now actually one of the largest African non-governmental organizations out there. Actually, I think the largest in the healthcare space in Africa. It started out in 1953 as I'm going to get this wrong, I always get it wrong, but it's the African Medical Research and Education Foundation. And it was founded by 3 physicians back in the 50s. There was an Englishman who was the former chief surgeon for the Royal Air Force in the Second World War, who had become a real expert in reconstructive surgery because a lot of these pilots had been burned. And over the course of his time, he had numerous trainees who came to work with him. And one of them was an American, a fellow called Tom Rees out of Utah. And Tom had an interesting history as well. He came from Utah. He went to the UK to train because this was really the place to get great plastics experience. And then he went back and he actually became the preeminent plastic surgeon in New York City. Like if you were a starlet in the 60s, this is where you got your nose job done. It was like Tom Rees was the go-to guy. And it was interesting. He had spent years sort of getting blackballed in New York. He wasn't really accepted by the folks, the powers that be, but he finally got hospital privileges and set up this great practice. But Tom and his colleagues had this practice of going to Africa every year for a couple months to work for this organization they founded called AMREF. And in the early days, it was these 3 guys who flew their Cessnas and Pipers around East Africa. They would, fly themselves to a dirt strip someplace. They would set up a table. They would have a clinic. They would do surgery in outlying hospitals. And basically just the 3 of them. I mean, kind of puttering around in these Cessnas, providing care. And over the years, the organization actually grew and grew and grew, and it became their organization was called the Flying Doctor Service. Flying Doctors turned out to be an air ambulance service, which was now the preeminent East African air ambulance service. The only people who can really get into airstrips, and they know all of the politics and issues in the countries they fly in East Africa. They do international repatriations as well. Top-notch service. But AMREF became the umbrella organization that does much more than aeromedical. They also do public health and hand washing and maternal and specialist outreach and all of those sorts of things. And so they're huge at this point. And so, but Flying Doctors was really the area that I got into doing as a volunteer flight surgeon for these folks in both 2008 and 2012. And it was basically just by virtue of a cold call. Like I had sent them an email. I had heard about them. I said, "Are you guys looking for a doc to come out with you guys?" And it was like a couple of days later, somebody wrote me back and said, "Absolutely. Like, can you be here next month? The doctor who was supposed to have been here couldn't make it, and can you show up?" And I was like, "Absolutely. Like, I'm there." I got my Kenyan medical license, and I was like on the plane to go hang out with these guys. It felt to me like this was a gift that had just dropped from the sky.
So what were the biggest differences between emergency medical care in East Africa and the Western healthcare system that you noticed?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, the care that we were delivering was very much Western standard care. And this was actually one of the interesting things about that's in the book, but this absolute contrast between the care that we were delivering in our little air ambulance, which had, pumps and drips and vents and, total state-of-the-art healthcare. And there were times that we would be sent to a county hospital in, say, Western Kenya to pick up a patient. And we would show up with this absolute Western standard equipment and care and protocols into a hospital that looked like it was in 1941, right? I mean, it was really, really resource poor environments. And so people did the best they could. Doctors were pretty solid there. And people did the best they could, but there just simply weren't resources to pay for more than a basic standard of healthcare. So primary care in Kenya tends to be pretty good, actually. Like the basics are well covered and everybody has access to, basic prenatal care and treatment for infectious diseases and malaria and those sorts of things. But anything a bit more complex really could be pretty lacking. And that's one of the reasons we were doing so many repatriation flights. But there were many times when the whole thing felt a little bit odd, right? Where you would show up into a ward of patients, several who had cerebral malaria and were comatose, in order to rescue one of those patients who had coordinated a flight to the tertiary center. And in the book, I describe the experience of actually intubating a patient in the ward and putting them on the vent and putting them on drips and getting the blood pressure, all the kinds of stuff you're supposed to do. And we left a room of 15 other folks behind with this, similarly sick. And it was this very, very strange contrast between worlds in Africa. But those are the main, it's really the main differences drive from scarcity, mostly, honestly.
So what was it like for you to process that after leaving that ward, when you had resources for one patient, but
I started to really question what we were doing. This comes up in the book a couple times. Every time you launch an aeromedical flight, right? And we were operating with 2 pilots, state-of-the-art aircraft, state-of-the-art equipment. I'm sure each of those flights cost thousands of dollars in fuel and landing fees and all those sorts of things. And as you're flying to pick up one patient, the question you have is really, should we be spending this money for one repatriation, or was the money better spent, say, providing for vaccinations or medication for a bunch of children? And this was a question I asked myself a lot. I ultimately came to terms with the fact that these repatriation flights, like, first of all, who makes the decision about how to spend those resources and using what criteria, right? These are sort of classic medical ethics, medical morality questions. And I kept coming around to the concept of the star thrower. I'm sure you guys have heard of this story. It's on every sort of self-help website.
It's one of our favorites.
Yes, it's a little bit, it's almost a cliche at this point, but it was meaningful to me. And Lauren Isley wrote about this in his book, the anthropologist and American writer, of walking down the beach and seeing these starfish and a bunch of sea life that had been stranded on the beach because the tide had gone out. And there was one guy walking along the beach throwing one starfish in at a time. And as Isley writes, he looks over and is like, why is this guy wasting his time throwing one starfish in at a time when you've got like millions of sea lives stranded and dying on the beach? And the fellow throwing the starfish in looks at him and says, it matters for that one starfish that I threw back. And I realized over the course of the book, of course, that if you happen to be the one in the hospital, or you're dying of some severe tropical infection in a field, and you happen to see the flying doctor's air ambulance flying over you and coming in for a landing, and you see this doctor and the nurse come out, and you realize that your life has been saved, there could be nothing more important in the world to you. And so this was sort of highlighted some of the tensions I felt oftentimes between being a doctor and being a public health worker, because I had trained in both. But at the end of the day, being a doctor means that you're caring for your patient to the best of your abilities. And to me, that time in Africa confirmed for me that there was something so primal and important about that one-to-one doctor-patient care experience. It turned out to be exactly what I had been seeking in the ER.
Yes, absolutely. So you've mentioned wanting to practice a more meaningful and authentic form of medicine in Africa. Tell us more about that.
That's kind of exactly what it was. I felt that what was driving me were the relationships that you formed with your patients. I remember being so impressed in medical school during like the white coat ceremonies and on graduation reading the Hippocratic Oath, and realizing that there was like something very important about the doctor-patient relationship, that this was a unique experience, and that many of the joys in medicine came from establishing a relationship with the patient, a trusting relationship, and being able to do something to cure their illness. I don't want to use the term sacred, but there is something sacred about this. It's a unique experience, and I wasn't getting that in the ER. And I did get this in Africa. And this for me was really what cleared my mind and made me appreciate that there was nothing inherently wrong with medicine. Like, medicine is such an important, and it's such a privileged place to be, and such privileged work that we can do, but it's been ruined by the system. And to never conflate the system with the joy of being a doctor.
Yes. And I will add, to those of you emergency physicians listening out there, you don't have to go to Africa to get that kind of experience. It definitely can, when we can get outside of this system, it definitely can help make it easier. But it is something that is achievable here. It's just a little more difficult. So you mentioned that visiting the world's largest refugee camp had a profound impact on you. What was that like?
So Dadaab is the world's largest refugee camp. It's located in northern Kenya, and it's not far from the Somali border. And Dadaab is created by, it's basically populated fully by Somali refugees who've been pushed out by the civil war in Somalia. So Somalia has been incredibly dangerous for years now. A lot of insurgency and fighting, and the civilians over the years have all sort of squashed across the border, and in some cases been integrated into Kenyan life, but in most of the time have been really housed in these refugee camps across northern Kenya, to some extent to the dissatisfaction of the Kenyan authorities, who kind of don't want them there. But they've got no place to go, and they've got these massive refugee camps that seem to get bigger by the year that several NGOs run, multinational NGOs. It's hard to convey the scale of Dadaab. So we would fly in regularly to pick up typically the workers, the NGO workers and others who'd gotten sick at the camps. And when you're flying over Dadaab, you basically go over northern Kenya, which is just dry. It's very dry. It's very arid and rugged territory with not much going on. Livestock, you have a couple local tribes that have built very simple sort of houses out of branches. You've got livestock, occasionally cows, very thin cows kind of running around. It's a really strange panorama. And then as you start to approach Dadaab, you see this thing rising in the distance. And what you start to realize is that it's basically a city of branches and plastic bags, and just a few structures that are there built by the NGOs, brick buildings. But for the most part, people are living under these brambles that have garbage bags put over them. And the thing that you start to realize about Dadaab is that it's not that this is some itinerant camp. I mean, this is actually where people have spent their entire lives. I mean, there are children there or adolescents there who have spent 15, 16, 17 years living in Dadaab. And it is perhaps the most hopeless, soul-sucking place that I have ever been. You land in a airstrip that runs through the middle of the camp. There are big chain link fences on either side of the fence, on either side of the field, with armed security officers, but like poorly equipped and poorly trained security officers. And there's one scene in the book that I recount where we landed, our plane came to a stop. The pilot was quite nervous. They basically always want to get out of there because there were real security risks in Dadaab. A couple NGO workers had been kidnapped. There had been explosions. And so we were in there to pick somebody up. And I remember as we were waiting for the ambulance to come to the airstrip to transfer the patient, this patient I write about in the book actually was one of the workers who had a psychotic break working in the hospital, sort of poorly managed mental illness, and needed to be evacuated. And I remember standing there waiting for the patient to show up, looking at the chain link fences and just hearing the background noise of the camp is just crying. Like there were just screaming children, hundreds of screaming children somewhere in those camps, and you can hear them across the fence. And there are a lot of children who just stood there with their fingers in the chain link fence staring at the aircraft as we came in. And I realized just how I started feeling almost ashamed of the privilege that I had, this ability to get on the plane and leave and come back and leave and come back, and had this total freedom and access and resources that these people just simply didn't have. And it was a really, you stare at these kids and you realize this is a life of absolute hopelessness. I mean, it's hard to express. And so I walked away really profoundly affected by that experience.
Yeah, I can imagine. Did it change anything for you in terms of the way you live, I mean, when you hear these stories, the optimist in me has to believe there has to be something that can be done. Any shred of hope in that situation?
I felt much more engaged, honestly, when I came back from Africa. So Africa had done two things for me. One is it had created that space to listen to my inner voice. It's a common theme, like travel's a common theme. If you think back to Eat, Pray, Love and those books, people, when they need to listen to their inner voices, oftentimes will step away into a place that's completely foreign to them because two things happen. I mean, number one is obviously your distance from your day-to-day problems. Number two is I think being in those foreign environments, you're very much more sensitive to the world around you because it's new. You're much more alert in foreign countries. And I think that alertness really allowed me to listen in a dispassionate way to what was going on in my own head and where I needed to go. And so my takeaway from spending that time in Africa was that there was an opportunity for me to actually try to improve things. I didn't have the skills or resources to fix Dadaab. I don't know who does. The Somali civil war is just going to have to sort of work its way through the system. But it did encourage me to go and try to fix things as best I could, having the skills that I had. And I felt much more engaged and optimistic about the work that could be achieved, strangely enough.
I love that. And the reality is there's just, there is something that each of us can do to make the world better. And if we all can step into that, wherever our sphere of influence is, then that can be leveraged, and it can really change things down the road for folks. If we can just take control where we can.
Agreed.
So in your book, you mentioned the transformative power of healing. How have you witnessed medicine's ability to transform lives?
I think it goes two ways. So clearly there's a transformation for the patient, right? It's one of the joys of medicine, I think, is witnessing the people whose lives you impact. So there's immediate feedback, particularly in emergency medicine, right? Although, as I write in the book, emergency medicine is oftentimes about beginnings and rarely about endings. We oftentimes don't get to see the consequences of our work. And that's, I think, one of the drawbacks to emergency medicine. And I write in the book of the 22 patients that I describe, I'll never see any of them again. But their lives have been profoundly affected by the work that I did for them. And I think in the final days when you're maybe, at retirement or trying to weigh the impact that you've had in life, I think as a doctor, it's nice to look back and say, I remember all of these patients and I've had this profound impact on their lives. And that's exceedingly meaningful. And so I think it goes two ways. I mean, it's certainly the patients benefit from this power of the healing relationship, but I think we benefit as well, so long as we can take the time to appreciate the work that's been done and the good things that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm currently reading The Gap and the Gain, and we tend to stay in the gap, of what's missing, how medicine should be different, and never take into account the gain, the people that we have helped, the incredible ripples that we've sent out. Like every time a family member, that affects their entire family. And we don't ever think about that or give any sort of credence or relish that at all. And so no wonder sometimes it seems pretty lame to go to our jobs. Like I mean, at one time I was like, am I even doing any good? We literally were coding people and bringing them back to life. Like, how could I ever get there? It's just so crazy. But it's because I would spend no time in the gain and spend all the time in the gap. But anyway, I mean, I think that's a human tendency, but it really does require in our jobs an intentional time to do that, because otherwise no one's going to do it for us. But it can make all the difference for sure. So the concept, moving on to back to the book, which is, man, I feel like so many people are going to want to read this. The concept of frontiers is a recurring theme in your book. What do frontiers represent to you?
This is such a good question. I quote a lot a guy called Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the second Secretary General of the United Nations, who they really founded the peacekeeping forces. And this was a guy who was brought down under suspicious circumstances in a plane crash in the Congo. And he was still a pretty young guy, but he kept a book called Markings, which was really his reflection on his internal. It's a very strange book, but it's a reflection on his internal voices and internal thoughts, and a little bit less about the work that he did on a day-to-day basis as Secretary General. But Hammarskjöld writes a lot about this concept of taking yourself to the frontier. And so there are obviously literal connotations here, but also abstract connotations. Certainly we cross frontiers all the time in Africa, going across 11 countries in East Africa, constantly crossing borders. I think the borders go beyond geographic borders. They were borders of backgrounds and cultures and languages. I read a lot about taking care of kids. It's 2 or 3 stories about the kids. One child that really struck me was we'd been called to the north to rescue a child who'd been hit by a car and was bleeding internally, and there were no surgeons in northern Kenya. And so we ended up picking up this child. It was his first ride in a car. The parents had taken him to the airstrip in a car. They'd arranged a ride. It was all of their first ride in an aircraft. They were simple people from a small tribe in northern Kenya. We didn't speak the same language. They didn't speak even the local language, Swahili, in Kenya. They certainly didn't speak English. I didn't speak any of the local language. I stared at them and I realized that, of course, there were so many differences. There were far more differences than similarities between us. Economic circumstances, cultural circumstances, languages, experiences. And so I was really aware of those borders. But of course, the thing that really bound us was that there were a lot of sort of important similarities when it came to being a doctor and a patient here. This was almost a universal language. And that was one example of kind of these frontiers, but I realized that there were many others as well. Certainly traveling to a foreign place, being away from home, pushing yourself, as Hammarskjöld says, to these frontiers kind of creates this sacred space to ask yourself the question as to whether the life you are living is the one that the life that you should be living is the one that you are living. Right. And that's really the question that confronted me is you've decided on this path in life. You have concerns about whether it's not the right path for you. Is this how you should be living your life, or should you be doing something else with the skills that you have? And being right on the frontier, I thought was really important to ask that question. And so that's why the concept comes up a lot again and again. And it was almost accidental. I mean, I didn't really plan on it, but I do recognize the theme keeps coming up again and again in the book.
I love that so much. So, man, this is so fantastic that you came to speak with us today. And I know a lot of people are going to want to read your book. Where should they go to get the book, or how can they learn more about you and the things that you're doing?
Sure. Yeah. So the book is available sort of on all the usual suspects. You can get it in independent bookstores. Amazon's got them. It's available on ebook, and you can get a audiobook if you want to listen to me drone on for a couple hours. You can get the audiobook as well. And I've got a small website, MD Munk, with a little bit more information. And so, please feel free to check it out.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time, Dr. Munk. I just, in reflecting what you're talking about, even taking a step back and looking at the broader scope of all this, it's really bringing the humanity back. We talk a lot about how we go through training, and it's almost unrecognizably stripped from our being when we become a physician, that, everything that got us to even want to become a physician is all about our humanity, is all about the wanting to help others, the wanting to do the things that we have, the time, talents, and treasures that we have to help others. And it's just ironic, I find, that when we take a step back and look at the big picture, by the time we're done with training, it's like nearly unrecognizable, all of those things. And what you did today in this time was just bring that breath of fresh air back, bring that touch of humanity back into this space, and allow our listeners and us just to focus on that, allow our brain to go back to that place where we were like, yeah, this is it. This is why we do this. And even just remarking on, however many patients you took care of in your travels to Africa, were hundreds, I'm sure, but just recounting the individual ones and remembering that each individual piece that they left with you, and then also reflecting on, I probably impacted them just as much as or more, and just leaving us with that, because that is something we can go to shift every single day exactly where we are with, is knowing we are star throwers, and every single patient, whether we bring them back, defeat the reaper for the moment, or, just offer a hand and say, hey, understand this must be hard, and maybe not have to do much other than that. So thank you so much for allowing us this time.
Well, I'll make one comment on this. The punchline to the book, there's an epilogue here about how I transitioned a little bit away from clinical emergency medicine into healthcare administration. And the organizations I've worked for have really been exclusively in the value-based care space. And I spent a couple of years leading organizations, primary care organizations, as the CMO. One of the organizations I worked for was a company called Iora Health, which was a healthcare for seniors company. And the slogan for the company was bringing humanity back to healthcare. It was coined by my boss and the founder of the company, an internist called Rishika Fernandez-Poulet. And Rishika's vision was to provide extraordinary wraparound care for seniors. And we were able to do it because of the different way that we were paid through Medicare Advantage. It provided a lot more money for primary care. And as a consequence, we had the freedom to build these remarkable systems where we had health coaches and beautiful clinics where patients could come in and hang out and have coffee and receive behavioral health. And we had dietitians taking them shopping for food, and we provided free transportation on Uber. And it was like, if you were a geriatrician, this would be exactly the practice that you wanted to build. It was humanity at its finest, long visits of 30 minutes with patients. And we saw the health metrics trending up. Of course, everything you wanted to see was exactly what we saw, because the doctors were able to sit down and build the system. And I think the one sort of thought I had about this when it comes to emergency medicine is that I think it's a mistake to accept the fact that the system is the way the system is, and that we should just suck it up and become like sort of more resilient, right? That's always the catchphrase. Doctors need to become more resilient. It's not about physician resiliency. It's about the fact that the system is broken, like fundamentally broken, and it's broken because of the decisions people have made about how to spend money and how to allocate resources. And so the one piece of encouragement I would give to my emergency medicine colleagues is that the system is inherently fixable. Like all it takes, as happened for our geriatrician colleagues, is this ability to use money differently and to ask the clinicians how to spend it in a thoughtful, intelligent way, and give people the freedom to design the system in a way that works. And it was just for my geriatrician colleagues such a relief to work in that environment. They said routinely it was the best job they had ever had. And we didn't incentivize people with RVUs and widgets and all that. People don't need to be incentivized like that. People want to work in an environment where they can deliver the kind of care they trained to deliver. And so I'm holding out hope that emergency medicine is going to get to that place where we have intelligent ways to fund it and give clinicians the freedom to design intelligent systems that provide great care.
Yeah, we will hold out on that hope with you. We stand in alignment with you, Dr. Munk. And thank you so much for being here. Again, thank you for your time. We know it's valuable. We know it's our non-renewable resource. So thank you for your time here. We really honor you for the work that you're doing and continue to do to bring humanity back to medicine. And if you've enjoyed our podcast today, don't forget, help us help you. So leave a review so that other fine physicians just like you can find us. And if you want to go to our website, check out our new Wellness 911 program. It's www.thewholephysician.com to get more information. We take demoralized doctors from fried to fantastic with our easy and evidence-based Wellness 911 program. So until next time, you are whole, you are a gift to medicine, and the work you do matters.